Good morning and welcome to our journey through the Bible in a year. And today we have an introduction to Philemon. Philemon is the shortest of Paul's letters, but don't let it trick you because it's the shortest. It certainly packs a punch. It's got some really explosive content in there. We're introduced in this letter to the recipient of the letter, who is a man named Philemon. Philemon was a wealthy man, a citizen of Colossae, potentially met Paul in Ephesus. He was a wealthy man, a significant man, and as part of his wealth and his significance, like many of the people of his day, he owned slaves. And one of the slaves that he owned was a man named Onesimus. And Onesimus, we're not quite sure why, but Onesimus ran away from Philemon, and in the course of running away finds his way to Paul, and perhaps he's trying to ask whether Paul would mediate on his behalf or speak for him to Philemon, and he actually does Paul a lot of good and serves Paul and blesses Paul. But Paul isn't happy with this breakdown in relationship. He knows that this breakdown in relationship doesn't honor God. God doesn't bless that disunity. And so there needs to be that reconciliation between Philemon and Onesimus. So he writes this letter to Philemon. And broadly speaking, it's kind of in two chunks. So the first part of the letter, the first sort of 7 verses or so, he is kind of praising Philemon, talking about here, when I remember you in my prayers, I always thank my God for you because I hear of your love for the saints and all that you're doing for Jesus. And he says to him in verse 6, I pray that the sharing of your faith may become effective when you perceive all the good that we can do together in Christ. He's talking about this fellowship. The word that we have for fellowship is from a Greek word called koinonia, and it's far more than just kind of shared participation in an event or even kind of a common community in that sense. It's a deep kind of bond that is rooted in the kind of expression of our whole lives lived out together for the purpose of the gospel. And that's what Paul is saying to Philemon. This is how we live together, isn't it? We have this deep fellowship that is rooted in Jesus, that's going to bring a lot of good to the world and to the community and to your city where you live. And I want to remind you of how grateful I am for your partnership in that and your fellowship in that. And then verse 18 to 20, he is talking about how Onesimus is part of that family of faith, part of that community, that fellowship, and that he needs to be reconciled. He needs to be brought back into the family so that it might be whole, so that fellowship might not be compromised in any way. And in verses 15 to 16, he makes a big request of Philemon. This is what Paul says. He says, perhaps this is the reason that he was separated from you for a while, so that you might have him back forever, no longer as a slave, but as more than a slave, as a beloved brother, especially to me, but how much more to you, both in flesh and in the Lord. So let's just take a moment to pause and see what Paul is asking of Philemon here, because Philemon was well within his rights as a Roman citizen to have Onesimus punished, potentially to have Onesimus thrown into prison. There were runaway slaves that had been killed before from running away from their masters. So all of the legal cards, the social cards, all of those things, they're in Philemon's hands here. And Paul is saying, not only do I want you to be merciful in the sense that I want you to take Onesimus back to the position that he was in before, but I want you to be gracious. I want your goodness to exceed that of simply being merciful. I want you to be gracious because I want you to take him back, not as a slave, but I want you to elevate his position to be a member of the family, to be a brother, to you. And not just because we could go, oh, that's the spiritual term, brother in Christ and what have you. But he says not just as a brother in Christ, not both in the flesh and in the Lord. So not just in the Lord, but physically you are to elevate him to the status and the position of being a brother. And that's a big ask. It's a big request that Paul makes of Philemon here. But it's, it's that change that takes place, isn't it? The exchange that takes place because of Jesus is that people who might have been deserving of judgment, of punishment, are now given grace through Jesus to receive being brought into the family. And, Paul makes it clear as we go to the end of the letter, verses 17 to 19, he says, so if you consider me your partner, welcome him as you would welcome me. If he owes anything, charge it to my account. So Paul is taking on the burden, as it were, the debt that is owed by Onesimus to Philemon. And we see that, don't we, in firstly the example of the Good Samaritan in the parable in Luke 15, that the Samaritan says, whatever he's owed, whatever is accrued from you caring for him, to the innkeeper, charge it to me. But also, we see that with the coming of Jesus, don't we? That our debt is taken on by Jesus so that we might become part of the family. We see that in 2 Corinthians 5:19, where Paul writes, that is in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and entrusting the message of reconciliation to us. So God in Jesus is not counting our trespasses against us because they have been paid by Jesus. That account has been settled by him. And so having received that and knowing that he'd received that, Paul encourages Philemon to live like that with Onesimus, but he's prepared to say, look, I'm not asking you to do something I'm not prepared to do. I'm going to take on the burden of the cost or the inconvenience or whatever it is that is owed. And you can be restored then, knowing that all things have been settled. So it's a massive social upheaval, a massive social change that takes place here in this really short letter. Paul is asking Philemon to lay aside the entire way that society works in order to live out the character and the nature of the gospel in his relationship with Onesimus. So I pray that as you read these short words, only one chapter today, that God might really bless you in the reading of it.